Thank you. So I'm Kirsten Blakey, and thank you to Hannah for organising this symposium. So today I'm going to be talking about rationality before the age of reason. So we know that children often revise their beliefs. We've heard a lot about this already in the conference. And they revise their beliefs when they encounter new information, either through testimony or new information they get for themselves. But just because a child replaces one belief with another doesn't necessarily mean that they are reasoning reflectively. You can replace a belief unreflectively if the evidence is strong enough. So research indicates that children revise their beliefs more readily when they're guided by trustworthy or more knowledgeable individuals. But how much insight do they actually have into the reasons for why they revise their beliefs in these kinds of situations or different kinds of contexts? So a popular philosophical view is that nonverbal or minimally verbal children supposedly lack the ability to reflect on and reevaluate their reasons for belief. And the idea here is that reflection relies on fairly advanced language skills. So after all, we usually frame reflection in terms of questions like, why does X believe that P? And if answering these kinds of questions is a requirement for rationality, then rational belief revision would only become possible around the so-called age of reason, so typically between 5 and 7 years old. However, many of us in developmental psychology would probably challenge this. So what is rationality? What definition are we using? So rationality is the capacity to form beliefs in response to reasons or evidence, which requires appreciating that following the evidence is the right thing to do. However, modern epistemology has become more open to unreflective responses to evidence, allowing that the appreciation of following the evidence being the right thing to do might remain implicit, so without the ability to articulate it either in thought or in language. So unreflective rational belief revision is when subjects form and revise beliefs based on relevant evidence without explicitly reasoning either verbally or non-verbally about the evidence that they have. And this can occur in at least 2 different ways. So first we have in response to positive reasons or positive evidence, such as forming the belief that there are apples in a cupboard when you've opened the cupboard and seen apples there. And then second in response to overriding evidence, such as replacing your original belief that there's apples in the cupboard with its negation when you go back to the cupboard and see that there's no apples there. So this second case illustrates an overriding defeater, and we heard a little bit about these yesterday as well from Hannah. So adults don't just revise beliefs automatically. They can reflect on their reasons, identifying why they've abandoned a belief and evaluating their evidence. But we don't fully understand how children transition from unreflective to reflective belief revision. And one way that we can study this is looking at undermining defeaters. So while overriding defeaters that I just spoke about tell us to replace a belief, undermining defeaters give us a reason to weaken a belief without believing the opposite. So they suggest that something could be wrong with the source of your evidence, for example, realizing that your memory might be unreliable or discovering that someone spiked the coffee this morning, and that might reduce your confidence in your belief rather than simply reversing it. So by studying undermining defeaters, we could reveal basic forms of reflective thinking that could be available to very young children or even non-human animals. And but how can we assess these undermining defeaters empirically in children? So there recently have been quite a few studies that have tried to start testing this in young children and non-human animals to see whether they respond to undermining defeaters. So here are some examples. But in these studies, it's not always clear whether the children were really reflecting on their reasons for belief, either due to the methods that were used or the findings themselves. One study, however, that did show that it's possible to test undermining defeaters empirically was led by Hannah Schleihoff in 2022. And in this study, they examined children's belief revision after receiving positive or undermining evidence from verbal testimony. And they found that 4- and 5-year-olds were more likely to revise their initial belief in response to undermining evidence compared to positive evidence, which is much earlier than the so-called age of reason. And this shows that we can assess undermining defeaters empirically in verbal children, but not whether nonverbal or minimally verbal subjects, such as very young children or animals, might be able to process them too. So therefore, our main aim was to try and find clear evidence of processing undermining defeaters in minimally verbal children without the need for language skills. So first, we wanted to be able to replicate this study that had already been done and extend the original paper to a wider age range of 3- to 6-year-old children, and also explore different responses to the different types of evidence when they were presented in isolation rather than combination. So I'll explain the methods a bit more clearly in a moment. And we then wanted to try and adapt the paradigm to be minimally verbal which included replacing the language-dependent testimony with auditory or visual stimuli and using eye tracking rather than verbal responses as the dependent measures. Okay, so first I'll go through the procedure for the original study, which is what we first tried to replicate. So participants were introduced to two characters and told that they have a bird, but the bird has flown away and they needed to find it. So there were two different trial types. We had positive evidence or undermining evidence, and in both, participants see two locations and a cue leading to one of them. So in this example, we've got footprints leading to one of the locations. They are then asked to help the character find the bird and asked, where do you think the bird is hiding? And we also ask them why. So then we find out more information. So we get in the positive evidence trial, the character says, these look like bird footprints. Look, bird footprints look like this. These footprints look just like that. And in the undermining evidence trial, the character said, these don't look like bird footprints. Look, bird footprints look like this. These footprints don't look like that. And then in both trial types, the second character adds some alternative evidence, suggesting the alternative location, saying, I believe that our bird is in the bush with purple berries because our bird loves purple berries. And the child is then asked again where they think the bird is hiding. So we have an initial belief and a second belief. So in all the figures that I'll show you, higher values indicate more belief revision. So in our first study, when we were trying to replicate the original study, we did replicate it. So we found that children were consistently more likely to revise their beliefs after receiving undermining evidence rather than positive evidence. And we looked at age, but there was no significant effect of age. So even 3-year-olds were showing the same tendency as the older children. So the darker blue is the undermining evidence and the lighter blue is the positive. And just for comparison, this is the results from the original paper. So slightly different scale there, but you can see that it's pretty much replicated, which is great. So after we replicated this and extended it, the age range, this indicated to us that the paradigm was a reliable measure of belief revision and an effective tool for assessing responses to undermining evidence. But before we attempted a minimally verbal version, we wanted to clarify how children respond to each type of evidence individually, as this was unclear previously because positive and alternative evidence were combined or undermining and alternative evidence were combined. And they were always presented together. So in study 1B, we therefore presented each form of evidence by itself. So it was set up exactly the same. So in this study, it started with the same two characters who had lost their bird, and they received this initial cue and were asked where they thought the bird was hiding. And then they received only one additional piece of evidence, either something about the footprints that was mentioned before in the previous study, or the alternative evidence about liking the berries in the other bush. And then they were asked again where they thought the bird was. So what did we find? So we tested 3 to 6-year-olds again, and we found that a main effect of trial type. So we found that children were more likely to revise their belief after undermining evidence compared to both positive and alternative evidence. And belief revision was also higher after alternative evidence than positive evidence, which we would expect. So children were clearly differentiating between the types of evidence when they were presented by themselves. So then we wanted to do our adaptation of the task to become minimally verbal and run both studies again. So to do this, we replaced the verbal testimony with auditory and visual stimuli and used eye tracking rather than verbal responses. So the general structure of the study stayed the same. So the first one had both positive and alternative or undermining and alternative evidence combined together. And rather than two characters, participants initially saw the animal that they were looking for. So in this example, we have a dog in between both locations, and then the dog disappeared and participants received the initial cue or evidence of the footprints leading to one of the locations. The only verbal part of the task was our question, where is the dog hiding? And then we recorded their gaze to capture their initial belief. And then we presented either visual positive or undermining evidence. So for positive evidence, this involves the animal being shown to make the same footprints that were leading to the location. And for undermining evidence, another animal moved away from the cued location, making the footprints that were leading to the cued location, suggesting that those footprints were not from the target animal. And then finally, we asked again where the dog was hiding. So sorry, I missed one. Finally, we also added alternative evidence. So instead of having the verbal testimony, we had a directional speaker play the animal sound from the alternative location before we then asked again where the dog was hiding. Okay, so I have an example of an undermining evidence trial. So this sound comes from the middle to begin with, so that they know what the animal sounds like.
Where is the dog hiding?
And they're asked where it is first, and we record their gaze during this period. And now the sound is coming only from the left-hand side, which is not possible to show here.
Where is the dog?
And they're asked again. Okay, so we ran this task with adults and also with slightly younger children, so 2 to 6-year-old children. So first, adults revise their belief more often after undermining than positive evidence, so replicating the pattern that we saw with the verbal study with 3 to 6-year-olds. And 2 to 6-year-olds also revise their beliefs significantly more often after undermining than positive evidence, although this difference was much smaller than in the verbal study and less than the adults in this study. Again, we didn't find any effect of age. However, 2-year-olds' response pattern seemed a little bit less clear, and they appeared to show a slightly different pattern of results to the older children's, but even when we excluded them, we found exactly the same pattern overall. So with the combined evidence trial types, we replicated the findings from the verbal task in adults and then to also some extent in children. Now we wanted to also look at the responses to the evidence types by themselves using the eye tracking version of the task. So again, we had the same structure of the task with the initial belief and the second belief with just one type of evidence. So like children in the verbal task, adults were more likely to revise their belief after undermining evidence compared to both positive and alternative evidence. And again, it was higher in alternative evidence compared to positive evidence. However, for children, the model was not significantly different from the null model. So there wasn't any effect of trial type or age on belief revision. There was slightly more belief revision following undermining evidence, but this wasn't significant. So with adults, we had replicated the findings of the verbal task that we did with children, but eye tracking data for 2 to 6-year-olds didn't indicate a difference between the trial types. So overall, we did find evidence of processing undermining defeaters in children using both verbal and minimally verbal methods, and our results suggest that we can assess responses to undermining evidence without relying on the language skills required for the verbal version of the task. Though we now also know that slightly younger children, 3-year-olds, can respond appropriately to the verbal task too. And therefore, our findings also suggest that reflective belief revision emerges before the age of reason, challenging assumptions about early rationality that are held by some philosophers. And there are still some open questions, such as why children and adults revise their beliefs so strongly after undermining evidence when it's presented by themselves, because you would think potentially that it would be less severe, the jump from your one belief to the next belief, like the negation, just because undermining evidence is supposed to weaken your belief rather than make it switch. But it could be a cognitive shortcut or a more practical response to the evidence that they have received. But we are still working on some of our kind of explanations for this. And we're also looking into why we don't see the pattern of results in children using eye tracking for the isolated cases. And these are questions we're trying to address with follow-up studies with adults and children. And we're also in the early planning stages for a similar behavioral study with dogs as well. So I'd just like to thank all of my collaborators and all of you for listening.